Before I introduce today's guest, I want to tell you about the latest deal with our sponsor, which is the Great Courses Plus, which is a app created by the teaching company and the Great Courses. Now, instead of purchasing individual courses and grinding through all 20 lectures or 30 lectures or whatever, I've created 2 courses myself. Along those lines, now you can buy through the app, you can subscribe to the program and listen to any lectures you want, thousands and thousands of lectures from lots and lots of different courses. You just tap on the app, it opens like that. And like, for example, I was just listening to a course on my George Orwell lectures. I was listening to a course on geography, understanding cultural and human geography. And here's a lecture I'm halfway through called The Problem with Geographical Determinants. It starts off like that. And it's great because, sometimes I get interested in a course and I want to listen to all the lectures. Sometimes I get bored and I want to try somebody new, or I just bounce around, and that's the beauty of it. So much like other systems, the subscription system is great for that because you have just this rich menu of options. So please go to our sponsors here. The deal is you get a free access to all the lectures for a certain period of time. If you do it through our website, which is the setup for our sponsor here, thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. So to get your free trial to the Great Courses Plus program, go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/salon. Thanks for listening. This week's guest is Stuart Russell. His new book is Human Compatible: Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control. This is Stuart's second book. His first is the classic Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. It's the pretty much the Bible, as it were, textbook of artificial intelligence. Stuart is a professor of computer science and holder of the Smith Zeta Chair in Engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. He has served as a vice chair of the World Economic Forum's Council on AI and Robotics, and as an advisor to the United Nations on Arms Control. He is Andrew Carnegie Fellow, as well as a Fellow of the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, the Association for Computing Machinery, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In this episode, we pretty much hit all of the main points about artificial intelligence versus human intelligence. What is intelligence? What is G in human intelligence? What is G in artificial general intelligence? What is artificial superintelligence? What the problems are, the arguments made on both sides, and what the responses are to those arguments on either side. And we get into some of the big issues of, what does it mean to be sentient? If a computer can be sentient, what would that even mean? And then all the control alignment problems, moral issues and values, and how you might program that in to a computer, and on and on. And then we end just talking about some of the applications or misapplications of AI, for example, by the Chinese social control system, the Russian hacking of our elections, Facebook, and so on. Super interesting topic. He's the man on this subject, so I was honored to have him. And with that, I give you Stuart Russell. Thanks for coming on the show. Congratulations on the new book, Human Compatible: Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control. I usually like to start these podcasts with little anecdotes of how I got interested in this subject or connected to your book. So I was out to dinner last night, a little small dinner party of about 10 of us with Eric Weinstein and Joe Rogan and Sam Harris and a few other people. And so as the conversation was ricocheting around the table, artificial intelligence came up. So we were, rifling through all the names, Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking. And so I said, hey, Sam, tomorrow I have Stuart Russell on my podcast. He goes, Stuart Russell, he is God, and his book is my Bible.
Now, given to say so, but
given that Sam is one of the 4 horsemen of atheism, of the new atheism, that's quite a compliment, I have to say. We've kind of tracked this subject for a while. We did an article on Skeptic. Let's see, this is 2006. artificial intelligence, can the human brain be duplicated? We did more recently, we did one on, let's see here. Yeah, could artificial super intelligence destroy us? I just have a digital version of that.
Okay.
Now, skeptic, we like to come at subjects like this. If it's clear and obvious what the answer is, like the earth is not flat, our article will have something about like the sociology of people that believe the earth is flat. And here are their arguments, and here's why they're wrong. But there's other topics where it's not clear what the answer is, particularly when the most knowledgeable people in the field don't agree. So, and this is what I mentioned, banding around these names. When you have super smart people like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates on one side, and say Steven Pinker and Kevin Kelly on the other side, say nothing to worry about, and so on. Now, we don't run science by authority or who's the smartest or, who's the most famous or whatever. But when super smart people who presumably know the arguments on both sides don't agree, that tells me something about the state of the science. It's like, in other words, it's really not clear what the answer is to these big questions. And so we need someone like you. I think your book nicely kind of outlines what the problems could be and what the responses are on each side. I particularly like I think it's your chapter 6, where you go through all the arguments and then here's the rebuttals to them. And I think I mischaracterized you in my Skeptic article as a AI dystopian. You're not. You're maybe, I don't know, would you call yourself a realist or something?
Yeah. No, I think the word dystopian has the connotation that you're predicting disaster. And it's, AI is not like the weather. You can predict a hurricane, and it may or may not happen, but we're not predicting what's going to happen with AI. We're saying, if you do things this way, the outcomes may not be what you want, but maybe there's another way to do things. But it has to be said, the way things are going right now, the form in which AI is being constructed and the entire conceptual framework for how we do AI seems to me a flawed one, and one that I think is already showing signs of causing problems in the real world, and will probably cause more and more problems until we straighten it out.
Before we get into the details of that, give our listeners a little bit of a background of how you got interested in this topic and what kind of pulled you into this particular debate.
So I've been doing AI a long time. I wrote a chess program when I was 14 at school, and I did a PhD starting in 1982 at Stanford. And the question at hand is really, what happens if we succeed as a field? So the goal of the field, in broad strokes, is to create machines that are as intelligent or more intelligent than humans. And no one was really answering the question, what happens if we succeed? And if you look back at what various historical figures have said, so Alan Turing, for example, who no one could accuse of being an ignoramus in this area, or a Luddite, said we would have to assume that the machines would take control. Period. End of story.
Right.
No ifs, no buts. That's it. And our species would be greatly humbled, even if we survive. So, and Marvin Minsky, another co-founder of the field, co-organizer of the 1956 meeting, also talked about the fact that it would be potentially catastrophic if we succeeded. And he and before him, Norbert Wiener pointed to this failure mode, which is that when you specify an objective and you leave stuff out, or you get it slightly wrong, as we invariably will, and then you create a super intelligent machine that's pursuing that objective, then it achieves the objective and you lose, because you're effectively setting up a chess match between it and the human race, because the objectives are in conflict. And then we lose that chess match. And So in the first edition of my textbook back in '94, I had a section called, what if we do succeed? And, then I wasn't that familiar with the arguments on each side. I was aware of, for example, what I.J. Good had said about the intelligence explosion in his 1965 paper. But it certainly points out the possibility that we would lose control. But by the last edition, which we did in 2010, the arguments had been made by various people, including Yudkowsky and Steve Omohundro, that it wasn't just that we would misspecify the objective and then lose the chess match, but almost any specific objective will necessarily cause the machine to want to acquire resources and protect itself simply in order to achieve the objective. So even if it's something as simple as, could you fetch a cup of coffee? The machine needs to make sure that it doesn't die along the way, that no one switches it off or otherwise prevents it from achieving the goal. And so it'll take every possible step to minimize the probability of any such event, which includes disabling its off switch and maybe even taking preemptive steps against any possible threat. And that's only logical, right? It's just a logical consequence of having the objective specified in that way. And
this is the alignment problem, right?
So that particular issue is called instrumental goals. That goals like resource acquisition and self-preservation are instrumental in any original goal that you give it. So fetch the coffee, fix the problem with the climate, cure cancer, any of these goals, or even calculate the digits of pi. Any of those goals would require that the machine continue to exist so it can achieve the goal, and would be better achieved with more physical computational resources. And so you sort of set up this inevitable conflict between the machine's purpose and broader human objectives. So starting around 2012, 2013, 2014, I started thinking, okay, how do we deal with this problem? Mm-hmm. And part of it is convincing the field that there is a real issue to grapple with. And then I gradually figured out in a few steps that the right solution is actually to change the way we think about AI, because this notion of putting the objective into the machine is the standard model for AI. It has been since the beginning. If you look at what Newell and Simon did with their general problem solver and later with the SOAR architecture, it all assumes that there's an exogenously defined goal. And the goal is it. That's all there is. And that's what the machine pursues. Same with McCarthy and his advice taker. Same with Nils Nilsson's shaky project at SRI. And the same today with machine learning, where you're minimizing a loss function with respect to some training set. But again, you specify the loss function and the system goes. Reinforcement learning, you specify the reward function, the machine optimizes it. So this is a very widely shared model for how to make automated systems. And the argument that I make in the book is that it's a really terrible engineering model. It's basically a mistake, because if you don't specify the objective completely and correctly, then the better your AI, the worse the outcome.
Terrible, you mean outcome terrible, or just it's wrong terrible?
So both. I think the outcome is going to be terrible, and the better the AI, the worse the outcome is going to be, because the system will have a bigger negative effect in order to achieve the objective you set. And that suggests that, in fact, conceptually, we came at the problem the wrong way. And I think if you go back to the 1940s, if you wanted to do AI, you had to have a notion of I, right? What is this intelligence that we want the machine to have? And I think they just borrowed the standard notion of rational behavior from, which goes back to Aristotle and others, but certainly in economics and philosophy, this notion of rationality has to do with your actions and how they relate to your beliefs about the future and your objectives about the future. And so rational decision making became the paradigm for AI because that was the paradigm we had for human rational behavior.
Yeah. There was a Star Trek episode in the original series where this M5 computer takes over the Enterprise and mistakes the other starships as enemies and then destroys them, and Kirk gets mad. So I'm going to go down there and unplug it. So, of course, he sends one of his minions with the red jerseys on, and the guys with the red jerseys always get killed. So the guy goes to unplug it, and it zaps him, and it's taken over its own power system. So pretty much captured in everything you just said there. And that was, 66, 67, that they already kind of were outlining that potential problem in science fiction. So that problem goes back a ways. I think the solution, Kirk trapped it in a logical loop or something. I forget what the exact solution was, but... yeah, so back to the start of your book, I really liked because we're talking about artificial intelligence. So you begin by talking about natural intelligence or human intelligence, but starting with E. coli, just a single cell, kind of moving through a liquid medium, following a gradient of glucose or whatever, turning left, turning right. That's a kind of the most basic form of intelligence we can think of, right? It's just trying to solve a particular problem of keeping an energy level up, so it's got to move left or right to do that.
Yeah, I mean, you could have a more basic form of intelligence where the behavior is completely pre-programmed and doesn't depend on sensory inputs at all. So,
but then there'd be no learning.
Yeah, so there could be. I mean, well, E. coli doesn't learn either, right? So there's responding to percepts, which is step one. And then there's learning how to respond to percepts, which is sort of step two, if you like. But step zero would be that you just behave because you're following a pre-programmed sequence of commands, which is what your typical welding robot is doing. It really doesn't perceive the car that it's supposed to be welding the door onto or whatever. And if you put a pumpkin there instead, it will just weld the pumpkin.
Right.
So that's sort of version zero of intelligence. And there are plenty of examples of that in nature as well. And the point of showing E. coli was just that nature can't anticipate everything, so it doesn't know where the glucose is going to be, and so it gives the E. coli the ability to find it by following these gradients. And then you sort of take that idea and just expand it up, and eventually you get to us.
Yeah. And I think of human emotions. I think people mistake human emotions as somehow completely different from reason or rationality. But in a way, it's just sort of a shortcut heuristic to get the organism to behave a certain way. So if you need calories, you don't have to do any calculating. You just feel hungry. So the feeling of hunger drives the organism to search its environment more, or the feelings of lust or whatever is nature's way of programming us to pass on our genes. And evolutionary psychologists always talk about, what people find attractive in members of the opposite sex. So men like women with a waist to hip ratio of 0.67, for example, and a symmetrical face and clear complexion and all. And women like men with broad shoulders and a narrow waist. But no one goes into nightclubs with calipers, looking for the right 0.67. Oh, I'm sorry, you're 0.72. You just look and go, I like that. So in a way, it's a kind of a shortcut heuristic. So you don't have to do all that calculating. But a computer wouldn't need, an artificial intelligence wouldn't need emotions because it can do the calculating of what it's, right?
Yeah, or I mean, it could learn. I mean, if you built a reinforcement learning system, it could learn to recognize the patterns of what turns out to be, a good choice for whatever objective you set it up. So when we build AI systems, they don't have to be explicit about the objective. So, for example, if compared two of the reinforcement learning systems that DeepMind built recently. So one is DQN, which plays Atari video games, and the other is AlphaGo, which plays Go. So DQN learns what we call a Q function, which is basically how desirable is each of the possible actions in the current state. So the current state is whatever's on the screen, or possibly the last 4 frames of the video, and then the desirability of the action. Well, I can go up, down, left, right, or press the shoot button, and those actions in this state have desirability 12, 9, 4, 3, and 17. So I press the shoot button. That's what it learns. It doesn't know what shooting is.
Right.
It doesn't know what shooting does. It doesn't understand how the world works at all, and it has no explicit objective. It doesn't know in any sense whatsoever that it's trying to find the gold and return it to base or whatever it is, right? Whereas AlphaGo does know the rules of Go. In fact, those are pre-provided in C++. And it reasons with those rules, and it does have the objective of winning the game. And if it finds a sequence of actions that gets to a win state, then it will take that sequence of actions. So these are two different ways of deciding. And in AI, we use all these ways, including completely reactive. Just if you see this input, then this is the correct action to take in response. So it doesn't even weigh the possibilities. It's just this is the right thing to do. And as humans, we have all of these ways of deciding. So when you blink, when a fly comes near your eye and you blink, you're not considering the reasons for that. And you don't explicitly have the objective of protecting your eyeball. Oh, I need to protect my eyeball, so I should blink, right? It just happens. But when you're playing chess, you're thinking about capturing his queen or checkmating or whatever. So we have all of these ways of making decisions, and AI systems have them as well.
Yeah, you addressed in your chapter 6 the not so great AI debate, which I really liked. I mean, this is a perfect model for anyone that wants to know what the 10 best arguments are on this side, 10 best rebuttals. So you have Pinker in here saying AI dystopias project a parochial alpha male psychology onto the concept of intelligence. They assume that superhumanly intelligent robots would develop goals like deposing their masters or taking over the world. It's telling that many of our techno prophets don't entertain the possibility that artificial intelligence will develop naturally along female lines, fully capable of solving problems with no desire to annihilate innocence or dominate the civilization. And then you provide, I think, a nice response to that. But back to the subject of emotions, and not just the hunger and lust and so forth, but even something like the desire for revenge or violence against somebody. Most of it is kind of moralistic in nature. And, as Dawkins says, the difference between a living organism and a rock is that if you kick a rock, it doesn't kick back. So you can't just kick other living organisms because they're going to kick you back. So you kind of have to develop a moral system in which on the dark side, the so-called evil side, is you have to have a reputation of being a badass, that I'm going to hit you back if you exploit me. So there's research on how hunter-gatherers deal with bullies and free riders and cheats and so on. They have to do something about it. And so here I'm thinking, if you're going to program an AI to be in a social environment, it's going to have something like these responses to people that try to exploit it. And maybe that's where we end up talking about evil robots or whatever. It's not really evil in an emotional sense. It's kind of a logical response to being exploited.
Yeah, I think in many of these arguments, about why we shouldn't pay attention to the risk, they begin by a falsehood, right? They begin by saying, oh, the people who are talking about risk are saying, A, the machines are going to become conscious and want to destroy us, or B, we're going to plug in these dominate the world objectives, and we don't have to do that. And in fact, no, those are not the arguments that are being made. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. I've always said, and everyone on this, on the non-skeptic side, if that's the right way of saying it, people who are arguing that there is a risk invariably say the risk does not come from machines spontaneously becoming conscious or sentient or whatever you want to call it. But many of the skeptic arguments begin by saying, well, these people assume the machine is going to become conscious. Oh, and right then we've already sort of separated from logical discourse.
Right.
So I think emotions have a role, as you said, an evolutionary role, a shortcut in decision making, and we could arguably design machines that way. And in some simple form, you could argue that, yeah, these reflex modes of decision making are a form of that. But so far, it hasn't proven to be a useful way of designing machines. And of all the systems that I can think of that do useful things in AI, I can't think of any of them that have really been programmed on the basis of creating these, let's call them pseudo-emotional responses, except the ones that are trying to, simulate paranoid behavior, as for example, Coles did.
So just to be clear, everything you're talking about in the book about concerns for future AI does not depend on these structures having any kind of sentience or self-awareness or consciousness or whatever the right word we want to use.
Correct.
That like Watson didn't even know it was playing Jeopardy, much less feel excited about beating the great Ken Jennings.
Exactly.
Right. So, but by the way, while we're on that subject, since you think about these deep issues, I'm always fascinated by the, how do we explain consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of other minds? How do I know I'm the only sentient being in the world and everybody else is a zombie and all that? What's the answer to some of those big questions from somebody who studies how to create this sort of artificial sentience or whatever it would be?
Well, I think you can go back to Turing, and he calls it the polite convention. Right? We have a polite convention that other humans are sentient. But we have much weaker evidence for the sentience of others than we do for our own sentience. Right? We don't have the first person experience that the other person has.
Right.
But we have a great deal of circumstantial evidence that our brains are constructed the same way, and I guess he was assuming that his brain was constructed the same way as other people's. But now that we can do brain scans, we actually see, oh yeah, indeed, even while alive, my brain is still constructed the same way. If you look at fMRI responses, they're pretty similar across different individuals to various kinds of stimuli, and so there isn't any evidence of anything significantly different in the brains of other people that would lead you to think that something different was going on. I would say that I don't believe that conscious experience is identical for everyone. I think it's clear that there are individuals whose experience is significantly different, particularly patients who've gone through various kinds of brain operations just seem to have a totally different affect, and they report very different experiences from normal individuals. But I think even supposedly normal individuals have very different scales of response. So the same stimulus that some people would find sort of mildly annoying, another person might find incredibly uncomfortable and causing enormous distress. And the same in the positive, same differences in the positive direction. And those questions actually matter a lot when it comes to how you design machines that act on behalf of multiple people. So how do you trade off the preferences of different people? Well, to trade them off, you have to understand some notion of a common scale. So how much suffering, how much pleasure, and you can't just assume a priori that everyone has a scale from 0 to 1, and 0 is the same for everyone and 1 is the same for everyone. Everything fits on the scale in between. I think there really is an empirical question. Do people have different scales, different degrees of affect resulting from various stimuli? And then morally, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Does that mean we just ignore that and give everyone the same degree of protection from negative stimuli, for example? Or do we take into account the fact that there are differences and protect people differentially?
Yeah, I apply the Copernican principle here to humans that, just as we're not special at the center of the universe, I'm not special. And if your brain is wired up the same way my brain is, more or less, same neurochemical transmitter substances, you have synaptic gaps, the whole thing, it's very likely that you also experience something like what I experience. I just, last summer, I had a nasty bike crash, so I broke a few things and I was in a lot of pain. So I go to the doctor. He's like, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10. So what he's after there is like, he doesn't know. And I don't really know. I'm just like, I don't know, 10. If 10 is horrible, then I'm a 7.5, I guess. And probably there must be kind of a database in the doctor's head. Like I've asked this question of 10,000 people, and I know a 5 to 8 needs this amount of painkiller and a 8 to 10 needs, a double dose or something like that. So we kind of try to tease out those internal states through those kinds of questions. So I could kind of see an AI doing something like that with a huge, millions of people that they've asked that question, how much pain are you in or whatever, even though they can never get inside somebody's head. You could have something like an approximation.
Yeah, I think you could try to find, so it's interesting because many economists will actually assert that there is no meaning whatsoever to interpersonal preference comparisons. And that's very convenient because it then justifies basically complete antipathy to redistribution. And so any policy which begins by saying, well, this is best for everyone overall, is immediately out of the window, right? You can only consider policies which do not trade off anyone's preference against anybody else's, but only improve things for everybody. But of course, those policies don't really exist. So it's hard to believe because what it's literally saying is, if Jeff Bezos has to wait 1 microsecond longer for his private plane to arrive, that's incomparable to a mother watching their child die of starvation over 3 months. You literally can't compare them at all. And so you can't make any trade-offs to prevent one or prevent the other.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Really believe that? Well, apparently they do because they then execute economic policy on that basis.
Maybe that's a way of calculating some of their mathematical models. Although, see, when the UN defines poverty as, what is it, $1.90 a day or less, and extreme, no, I think it's $2.50 a day or less, extreme poverty, $1.90 a day or less. So they've made some sort of calculation of how much suffering, that we're willing to put up with versus, we have to intervene and do something. Or someone like Andrew Yang's UBI, $1,000 a month is kind of a minimum you need to get to a certain level where you're not suffering. Something like that.
Yeah.
Again, we're trying to capture these internal states through some kind of objective criteria, which is difficult to do. All right, let's turn to Kevin Kelly's famous article in Wired magazine that you addressed. The article is originally titled "The Myth of a Superhuman AI," but then I noticed that the editors or somebody added "The AI Cargo Cult" as this actual title of this article. So I think that's maybe an editor's way of provoking to get more readers or something like this. And so, of course, you're mentioning this and you address it. But so he starts, and Kevin Kelly, everybody respects him, as do I. So he starts off with this idea of intelligence. What do we mean by this? And he's arguing there's no such thing as general intelligence. So what is it that you guys are doing when you're trying to build AGI or ASI when humans have a very narrow kind of intelligence? Chimpanzees have their own kind of intelligence. Even different human groups. In reading your book, I was thinking of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, when he talks about in that first chapter of spending time in Papua New Guinea with the hunter-gatherer groups there. And he has friends there. And He said, if here he's a famous professor at UCLA, one of the smartest guys I know. He said, if you plot me down into a hunter-gatherer group in Papua New Guinea, I'd be dead in a week. All my intelligence is completely useless for that kind of life. So intelligence is very narrow.
That's the kind of apple-orange comparison, because that's not what happened to the hunter-gatherers either. I mean, if a hunter-gatherer was plopped down in a hunter-gatherer, they'd also be dead in a week, because they're good at hunter-gathering because they grew up in that. So if you took Jared Diamond when he was a baby,
oh yes, okay,
and
right,
founded him from LA and had him grow up in Papua New Guinea, I'm sure he'd be a great hunter-gatherer.
That's true. That's very true. Yeah.
I think, within AI, it's a good question, right? What do we mean? What are we pursuing? And I think we kind of know what it is that we're after, but we haven't really done a good job of articulating exactly what we mean. And if you look at the various attempts, so Nils Nilsson basically said, something that could learn and excel at every human occupation. But of course, there aren't any occupations that humans are not good at, because if no humans could do them, it wouldn't make sense.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
There are certainly occupations that very few, like, being a number theorist, right? There's very few humans who are good at that. Even if you try a lot of training, it's just a really tough thing for the human brain. When I don't think we're particularly well adapted for doing that kind of work. So it isn't easy to come up with a notion of generality. But what we mean is that if you plop the system down, and obviously you've got to sort of, in some sense, protect it while it's learning, as we do with children, but it can acquire the knowledge, the capabilities for whatever task environment it's placed in. And we know, there are examples of generality. For example, DQN is within the class of things it can do pretty general, right? It plays these Atari video games, and they range from, Space Invaders, where you only move sideways and you have you got left, right, and then you got a shoot button, to, and it's two-dimensional. But then also, three-dimensional car racing games where the screen is showing you a three-dimensional scene, and you're steering a car through that. You've got Breakout, you've got all kinds of maze games, Pac-Man-like games, and so on. So the system was able to play all of those. Eventually, they figured out, I think, pretty much all of those games at a superhuman level. And clearly, if a human baby, was born and 2 hours later was playing all of the Atari video games at a superhuman level, you'd be worried. You'd be calling in the priest for an exorcism or something. So, but we know that approach, DQN approach, only works for certain classes of task environment, right? It has to be fully observable, meaning that everything relevant to making decisions is on the screen. So you can see it. So that means you don't have to keep track of what happened in the past in order to know what may be true, but you can't see it right now. Right now, of course, in the real world, it's not fully observable. There's lots of stuff like, if I said, "Where's your car?" I'm guessing you can't see your car right now, but you know where it is because you know where you left it, and you know enough about physics to know that it probably stayed put. And so DQN wouldn't work if you plopped it down in task environments where it can't see everything at once.
Right.
It also wouldn't work in task environments where the decision horizon is a long one. So mostly in video games, because they're designed to be sort of fun, you're not supposed to sit there and think for hours about what to do next. The consequences of your actions happen fairly soon, and the goals are reachable in a very small number of actions. But in real life, if you think about a goal like getting a PhD, that's 6 years and roughly 1 trillion motor control choices.
Right.
And so there's absolutely no possibility that a DQN-like algorithm could succeed in that kind of task environment. So, but what we work on then is, okay, how do we relax the assumption that the environment is fully observable? How do we lengthen the decision horizon? And there are partial solutions to those problems. And as you relax those assumptions, each time you sort of magnify by 100 the range of task environments that the system can handle. And you keep knocking down these obstacles, and eventually it's everything, right? It's really hard to come up with a task environment that the system can't adapt to and succeed in. And that's kind of where humans are. We can't deal with everything, right? I mean, there are things built in. For example, our eyes assume that that neighboring pixels are related to each other. So our whole visual system is based on that assumption that there's spatial contiguity in your visual input. But if you were in an environment where it's just every prime numbered pixel that matters, the other ones don't matter at all, right? We'd be completely unable to function in that environment. We would just fail. We would never ever learn what was good. Now that's an assumption. Maybe some neuroscientists will prove me wrong, but I'm pretty confident that it just wouldn't work.
Is there an analog of the G in AGI with G, general intelligence, that intelligence test psychologists study, namely that if you score high, say in the matrices portion of the IQ test, you're very likely to score high in the similarities and the mathematics and the verbal reasoning and so on. So there appears to be a general intelligence that humans have that's somehow floats above the very specific kinds of intelligence that, say, Kevin Kelly's talking about here, solving specific problems. And there seems to be a correlation between those, that general and then the specifics.
I mean, I think that's the reason why we have a notion of IQ or little g, which is the sort of professional psychologist version of IQ, because there is this correlation that scoring high on one part, one test typically is correlated with scoring high on other parts. And then people have pushed back against that. Howard Gardner, for example, with his, I think, seven kinds of intelligence. And this is partly what, Kevin Kelly's article is getting at, that there isn't one dimension of intelligence. And that's true. It isn't, we can't be lined up perfectly along a single scale. But roughly speaking, both intuitively and when you try to measure people, there is this strong correlation. And there are people that who are really, really smart, and you'd be willing to bet that, put them in a room with any kind of intellectual challenge, they'll do well.
Yeah.
And other people maybe less well. But that's, I think, in the sense that we're talking about with AGI, the G, generality, is something that pretty much all humans exhibit. So now the I part, right? The how well do you do? Maybe that varies a bit. Like how quickly do you learn, and how complex are the problems you can solve within that class of problems. But generality seems to be something that humans have in spades, and that's really what we lack. In fact, on any particular class of problems, it seems like the I part, if you like, we can make machines excel. If we know how to do that at all, then we can do well. But the G part is the generality, and there, as I say, we're still working on it, but we are making progress, and it is not, so I think it's really important for people to understand that we do not work on one task at a time. So when the guys at DeepMind were working on AlphaGo, they weren't really working on Go at all.
Interesting.
What they were working on is, can I come up with a method which is sort of, in fact, domain independent, that's sufficiently powerful that when I apply it to Go, it becomes really good at Go. And they, the method they chose, reinforcement learning, plus deep convolutional networks to represent your estimates of how good a go position is are completely general, right? Neither of those has anything to do with go. When you go back and say, well, where did the convolutional neural networks come from? They came from people working on handwriting recognition at Bell Labs. So that's where Jan LeCun got his start, was handwriting recognition. So he wasn't working on handwriting recognition. He was working on general pattern recognition capability that would be powerful enough to solve handwriting recognition. And it was. And it turned out it's also powerful enough to solve Go and
Interesting.
object recognition in images and speech recognition and so on. So it's not like, okay, there's a billion tasks and we're doing them one at a time.
Right.
There are these sample tasks that we work on. And part of being a good AI researcher is choosing a good task whose solution will lead to improvements in general techniques. And that's, and there are only, a handful, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 25, but a relatively small number of advances that need to happen before the generality part becomes something, comparable to what humans have.
I was thinking about that in reading Kevin Kelly's article and then your response to it, reading now from your book. Now, one obvious response is that a machine could exceed human capabilities in all relevant dimensions of intelligence. In that case, even by Kelly's strict standards, the machine would be smarter than a human. But this rather strong assumption is not necessary to refute Kelly's argument. Consider the chimpanzee. Chimpanzees probably have better short-term memory than humans, even on human-oriented tasks such as recalling sequences of digits. Short-term memory is an important dimension of intelligence. By Kelly's argument, then, humans are not smarter than chimpanzees. Indeed, he would claim that smarter than a chimpanzee is a meaningless concept. This is cold comfort to the chimpanzees and bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, whales, dolphins, and so on, whose species survive only because we deign to allow it. Right. And that's only really just within the last maybe 50 years that we've even cared about other forms of intelligence and sentience.
Yeah, right. I mean, we've wiped out loads of species because, it doesn't matter whether there's some dimension on which they perhaps exceed human capabilities. On the dimension of survivability, and I think it's the human the generality that is what allows us to defeat pretty much any
live anywhere we want because we can change the environment, and anything is in the way. It's just in the way. And this is the point you're making with all this, is that it's not that they're evil. They're just consuming resources to survive. That's what we do.
Yep. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I read a lot of books with my kids. And if you go back to books in the 18th century, like some of these desert island books, first thing people do when they see an animal is kill it, and it's just like, there's no like moral theory here. It's just what you do.
Right.
It's like you see rain, you go under a tree, you see an animal, you kill it. It's what you do. And then like by the late 90s, there's maybe one member of the party, holds the rifle back to stop the other guy from killing the animal, because they have some qualm about it, and now, of course, we wouldn't be wiping out dodos just for the fun of it, and so on.
So could we not program into a far future AGI, whenever that's going to be, something like a Declaration of Human Rights that would also include animal rights or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, that's what I'm proposing. It's in its most general form. The machine's objective should only be human well-being or satisfying human preferences. And there is a question about animal rights, and I talk about that sort of immediately because the issue of putting human preferences as the only criteria for machine behavior is immediately raises the issue. Or what about other sentient beings? And I think sentient here is important because rightness only attaches to things that have subjective experience. And we're not going to worry about rocks as far as I know, right? And you can maybe argue about trees, but the question of animal rights is an interesting one. But since the decision is being made by us as to how we design the machines, I can't come up with a good argument for saying that we should design machines to care more about animals than we care about animals, right? Because the caring sounds good, of course, but it comes at a cost. And we make that trade-off. And you could argue we make that trade-off in a very myopic way, that we don't consider the long-term consequences of habitat destruction and so on. And we don't. And I think it would be fine for the machines to say, look, given how much you care about animal well-being, you shouldn't be doing that. You should do this instead, right? But it's a different argument to say, okay, we've considered all of human preferences about animal well-being and about human well-being, and we understand what humans think to be a reasonable trade-off, but we're going to program the machines to have a different trade-off, right? Where we give more preference to animal well-being, which means that then humans have to live in smaller houses with smaller gardens and only drive their car once a week, and so literally there's a real cost, and I can't see a justification for programming machines to make that trade-off differently from the way humans want it to be made.
Right. Well, there again, back to the alignment issue, we would just be aligning their values with ours as they currently stand, but those change over time.
Yeah, and I think as our preferences change, the machines will track them.
Yeah.
And there's another argument about are our preferences reasonable or moral or correct, and should we have the machine follow the correct preferences rather than our preferences? And I think that's a dangerous route.
Yeah.
To go down.
Yeah. You go down that. I like that discussion with Hume. Let's see, where was that? 287. I like that section because I've kind of struggled with that issue myself, the is-ought issue. There's this, this is in one, I think this is in one of your appendices. No, Hume, you talked about not breaching the is-ought barrier, which I like to do when I can, because I think it's not, here it is, 167. Sorry, listeners, I'm just finding this really interesting section here. Right. The idea that it is possible to perceive objects of the world was discussed at length in a famous 18th century treatise by David Hume, Treatise of Human Nature. He called it the is-ought problem and concluded that it was simply a mistake to think that moral imperatives could be deduced from natural facts. To see why, for example, consider the design of a chessboard and chess pieces. One cannot perceive in these the goal of checkmate, where the same chessboard and pieces can be used for suicide chess or indeed many other games still to be invented. But still, that the idea that I prefer to be free than enslaved, healthy than sick, have food rather than be starving, and so on. These are kind of facts about nature that also have a moral valence to them that we then call a value. We value freedom, we value prosperity, and so on as a human value, as a sort of a check on suffering. So there, it seems like you can kind of make that transition from the way things are to the way things they ought to be. Suffering is bad, so we ought to attenuate suffering. That seems to be something you could program into an AI, and therefore now we're talking moral values.
Well, yeah, I don't think we're disagreeing. We're just using different words.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The same thing. So you could argue that, that the ought has to come from somewhere, and since it can't come from outer space,
Right.
It's coming from something that we're perceiving, so maybe you could say, the ought is really sort of projecting our own preferences about what we want to happen or not happen to us, sort of onto some kind of objective moral code. So there's no mystery here. The reason why I want machines to satisfy human preferences is because those are the things we prefer. And we should build machines to do what we prefer to have happen.
Yeah.
But beyond that, there's one other place where I think we need to sort of be interventionist, and that's the issue of people with sadistic preferences,
right.
Who literally prefer the suffering of others. Because if you're trying to satisfy the preferences of lots of people, and some of them prefer the suffering of others, then to the extent that you satisfy those preferences, you end up hurting other people. And this is something that Sir John Hassani, who I cite a lot in the book, because I found myself agreeing with him a lot, is an economist who thought quite a bit about sort of the connection between preferences, utility, and sort of moral imperatives. And he says that, there's no moral obligation on me to hurt some third party just because you prefer to hurt people. I don't have to help you.
Yeah.
And so that argues that we should zero out those sort of negatively altruistic preferences.
Well, there are people that do that, and when they act on it, we lock them up.
Yep. And so in some sense, we're zeroing them out, right?
All right.
We're making sure that they're not acted on.
So something like regulation of artificial intelligence would be something like that. We're putting checks and balances on its development in a regulatory fashion, like we do any other technologies. So here I'm thinking of this, the issue of, I have a Tesla, so I push the little button. I say, navigate LAX, and it's going to take me in the shortest route with the least amount of traffic. Now, why wouldn't it go up on the sidewalk? Because there's no traffic on the sidewalk and plow through pedestrians. Well, the moment this happened, the regulators would be in Elon's office the next day saying, we're shutting you down if you don't fix this. And already, he's been sued so many times. There was that guy in Florida where the front camera was blocked by the sun and it didn't see that tractor trailer come across, and the guy was killed. Then I noticed after that, now there's a new alert that comes on. If the sun's in front of the car, it comes on and says front camera is blind, so take over control of the steering wheel. So obviously they programmed that in. Is this not sort of incremental regulation and control of a potential AI type problem?
Yeah, I mean, those are, maybe you might call it sort of safety in the small, where the consequences, could be serious to one person, but it's not a sort of systemic threat to human existence. But that general approach, which is in some sense to sort of try to fence in the behavior of the system by making prohibitions, like, okay, we see the system behaving badly, so now we make a rule, right? You're not allowed to do this, right? You can't drive up on the sidewalk, you can't go through the red light, you can't do this, you can't do that. In the book, I point out that we've been trying to do that with tax law now for 6,000 or 7,000 years.
Right.
Pretty much failed. And so I call it the loophole principle, which is if a sufficiently intelligent entity wants to bring about some kind of objective, then trying to put fences around it, trying to constrain its behavior, is in the long run is going to fail, because it will find ways around. It'll find the loopholes, and the best way is to make sure that it doesn't want to do that, or in the case of taxes, that it wants to pay taxes, right? And so the way the three principles are set up is designed to make it so that the machine wants to do the right thing as far as humans are concerned. And of course, it still may fail because it lacks enough knowledge, or it misunderstood some of its perceptual experience, and it makes incorrect predictions. But naturally, those things over time are going to get fixed.
Maybe if you solve that problem in AI, you can back engineer it into human psychology for wanting to pay taxes or something like that.
Well, I thought about it. I mean, it's an interesting question. The principles. So the principles basically say, number one, the AI system's only objective is the satisfaction of human preferences, and number two, it knows that it doesn't know what those preferences are, and then number three, it can learn more about human preferences by observing human behavior or choices that we make. So those principles could apply to any system that you want to design, including, for example, corporations. And corporations, we made the same mistake of misspecifying the objective. We specified the objective as, maximize expected discounted sum of profits over time. And of course, and when everyone knows that when you do that and you ignore the externalities, then you get, climate change, you get corruption, you get this, you get all kinds of negative consequences because you set up an optimizing system that doesn't care about those things. You set it up to only care about expected discounted quarterly profits, and that's a mistake. And could you design the economic system or even the democratic system? Right, same thing applies to governments. Could you design them differently so that they would want to pay their taxes, so to speak, or they wouldn't have this this out of control adversarial behavior?
Yeah, here I'm thinking of something like laws against burning women as witches in the United States. We don't really need the laws anymore because people don't even think about doing that, whereas we used to do that. So we've kind of changed the values and made them internal to the machinery rather than external based on the laws. Although it's probably still good to have the laws just in case. And
I think you have to keep up the pressure, so to speak. Right, you've got to you have to make sure that whatever process it was that extirpated those kinds of preferences, that those processes are still functioning, so that they don't creep back. And I think there's something that is a little worrying about the way things are going now, when you see people advocating policies that led to the extermination of 6 million Jews. And so this is a great thing. We should go back to those kinds of political views.
Right. I think the further
wrong in our sort of moral education system.
Yeah. I think the chances of going back to that is pretty slim. But just in case, we should have laws because it's not always internal. I was just going to get a quick take on your response to Pinker's argument on the alleged self-refuting nature of these arguments. He says they depend on the premises that, one, humans are so gifted that they can design an omniscient and omnipotent AI, yet so moronic that they would give it control of the universe without testing how it works. And two, the AI would be so brilliant that it could figure out how to transmute elements and rewire brains, yet so imbecilic that it would wreak havoc based on elementary blunders of misunderstanding. The ability to choose an action that best satisfies conflicting goals is not an add-on to intelligence. Then engineers may slap themselves in the forehead for forgetting to install. It is intelligence. Anyway.
Well, I think that's a longer story than we have time to tell. This is an argument he makes in sort of in the broader context of what he calls the 21st century culture of safety.
Right.
And so, roughly speaking, he's arguing that since that would be a bad outcome, it couldn't possibly happen. And therefore we shouldn't talk about it. Right now, 2 points to make. One, Chernobyl. Two, the way the culture of safety works is by people talking about possible bad outcomes and figuring out ways to prevent them.
Precautionary principle, yeah.
It's kind of ridiculous to say you shouldn't talk about the possible bad outcomes because they'll just be prevented anyway, right? It's like, as I say in the book, it's like being at the scene of an accident and saying nobody should call an ambulance because somebody's going to call an ambulance. Right. Well, that's a self-defeating argument.
Right.
So it's entirely possible within the standard model of AI. It's not imbecilic, right? This is the kind of the issue that is missing here in this analysis. It's not imbecilic to pursue an optimal policy for the objectives that are built into the machine. And as we saw with the is-ought argument, if these are the objectives built in the machine, there's no way that the machine is sort of perceiving its world and perceiving that the objective it's pursuing are wrong, right? With respect to what other objectives could it perceive that these objectives are wrong? There aren't any, right? Its objectives are the objectives by definition. So it's not imbecilic for it to just pursue those optimally if it's designed in the standard way. So what I'm arguing is we need to abandon the standard model because it leads to this potentially catastrophic outcome.
Yeah.
He's saying, well, no, you're not allowed to point that out. Well, if you're not allowed to point that out, then you're not going to fix the standard model and you will have the catastrophic outcome. Just like guys in Chernobyl who said, in fact, they knew right when the machines were designed that it had this potential catastrophic outcome. So what did? They banned
That's
that
true.
fact
That's a good
from
point.
being made public. They removed those pages from the reports describing the design of the reactor. And that's exactly what Steven Pinker is recommending. And that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. I think it was Stuart Brand who made the argument about nuclear power was never allowed to go through its early experimental stages of failing like the airline industry did, just starting with the Wright brothers. And, you have maybe 20, 30 years of just crash, and huge improvements because of that. We're not going to allow, lots of meltdowns, 100 Chernobyls, so we can figure out the perfect design.
Yeah. And I think, but we are experimenting with AI systems built along the standard model, and we're starting to see failures. And they're getting, the early aeronautical failures were mostly single engine, single pilot aircraft, and they were very brave people, and a lot of them died. But with nuclear power, it wouldn't be one person who dies.
Yeah, right.
It might be thousands or whatever. And with AI systems, where the failures have occurred in the lab, gazillions of times. Most AI systems, when you start them running, don't do what you think they're going to do. A lot of the time, they just do something completely stupid. Sometimes they do something weird, and I give some examples of that in the book. But it was always in the lab where there were no real consequences. But now we've got the AI systems out there in the real world. We've got the learning algorithms operating the social media platforms. We got the fraud detection. We got the self-driving cars. And we're starting to see that, wow, yeah, these algorithms do fail.
Yeah.
And the self-driving cars, it's been these individual local failures. But the social media platform, it's a global failure. And whether you think it's a filter bubble failure or something more sinister, a kind of manipulation process that I describe in the book, it's clear that there was not sufficient analysis before that system was deployed about what the consequences would be of pursuing those particular objectives, click-through maximization. I had an interesting discussion with Jan LeCun. There was some Facebook page, and someone asked me, "Why don't you pitch into this discussion?" And Jan LeCun was saying, "Well, it's completely impossible that anyone would deploy a powerful system with the wrong objective. That would be extremely stupid." And I, sort of précis of the discussion was basically, well, what about click-through? Maximizing click-through, potentially a really bad thing to do. And he said, "Oh, we stopped maximizing click-through a couple of years ago." Well, why did you stop? Well, because it turned out to be the wrong objective. So you deployed an extremely powerful system with the wrong objective. Okay,
right.
So it's not only not unlikely it already happened, and it was extremely stupid.
Just to follow up on the Picker point, from in Enlightenment Now, I don't know if that's where you got the quotes are from his edge.org article, but he does quote you in a positive way here. It says, when we put aside fantasies like Froome, digital megalomania, instant omniscience, and perfect control of every molecule in the universe, artificial intelligence is like any other technology. It is developed incrementally, designed to satisfy multiple conditions, tested before it is implemented, and constantly tweaked for efficacy and safety. As the AI expert Stuart Russell puts it, quote, no one in civil engineering talks about building bridges that don't fall down. They just call it building bridges. Likewise, he notes, AI that is beneficial rather than dangerous is simply AI. Anyway, I think that more aligns with what you're arguing in your book.
I mean, my argument, but that's not the way AI is right now.
But that's the goal, right?
That's the goal. The goal, and I lay things out in the book. But it's we're trying to turn around a supertanker.
Right.
There's billions and billions and billions of dollars invested in this way of doing things, which I think is the wrong way of doing things. And I'm not innocent of some of this, but the whole conception of the field is around the standard model of optimizing objectives that are exogenously supplied.
Yeah.
And not just AI, right? Control theory, statistics, operations, research, economics, they all operate on this basis. And so I'm trying to turn around a good chunk of the technology and intellectual output of the 20th century. It's not straightforward.
No, not at all.
I don't think it's going to happen automatically.
I want to be mindful of your time, Stuart, but I want to hit just a couple of other issues quickly about what keeps you up at night. For example, the Chinese social credit system using facial recognition, 300 million cameras in the society here. The problem is not AI, it's human intelligence or human desire to control people using the technologies you guys work on.
Yeah, I think misuse is a serious issue. And surveillance, control, autonomous weapons. I suspect that, I could be wrong, but I suspect that systems like the social credit will be quickly seen to be failing, in the sense that, as always, when you specify a fixed objective, you get what you ask for and not what you want. And that will happen with the behavior of the Chinese people. They'll find all kinds of ways to game the system and get a good score while doing exactly the opposite of what the authorities want to have happen.
Yeah.
And even if you take the authorities' goal as a benign one, that they want a harmonious society where people are nice to each other and look after each other, they're going to get a society where people are just point scoring and have lost the notion of moral value altogether, which is hardly what they want. And autonomous weapons are a real concern. And then, in the long run, this misuse issue. So even if we develop provably beneficial AI technologies and we maybe even pass laws saying this is how AI systems have to be designed, otherwise you can't sell them or you can't connect them to the internet, people may still bypass the safety mechanisms and use the AI capabilities to carry out their plans and then have a control failure that way. And so misuse and that's something I don't have a good solution to. It's much more of a socio-technical and sort of policing problem, regulatory problem, educational problem, moral standards problem. And we're having the same concern about synthetic biology. How do we prevent people from creating pandemic organisms in their garage? It's a really tough problem, and they are taking very concrete steps. The DNA synthesis machines have now built in technology that detects any attempt to synthesize disease sequences or sequences of DNA from disease organisms. And they will report you to the FBI if you try to do that. So that's an example of policing activity, trying to nip this in the bud. But for AI, of course, it's really tough to know what kind of C++ program, you have to, put in detectors for, and so on. So it's quite a difficult problem. And then the other problem is sort of the overuse problem, that we come as a society just to rely so much on AI to do everything for us, that we kind of lose our own autonomy, our own capabilities as individuals and groups and societies. We become enfeebled. That's a real issue, and it's one that has been dealt with in literature for a long time. And again, I don't have a good solution for it. So.
Yeah, no, I used to be really good at reading maps, and now I don't even bother. I just plug in the address and off you go. But speaking of which, so could somebody actually take over the steering wheel in my Tesla and drive me into a wall, or worse, all cars in, say, 10 years or 20 years are autonomous vehicles going down the freeway 6 inches apart at 90 miles an hour, and somebody hacks the system and the entire 405 freeway in LA is shut down?
I suppose it's possible, yeah. I mean, usually when people have said, oh, no, there's no way to hack into system X.
Right. Somebody does it the next day.
Usually turns out to be false.
Right.
No one goes out to build an insecure system, but they all succeed in building insecure systems. So I think that, on the misuse question, it's a natural outgrowth of what's already happening with just the misuse of software, creating malware, and whether it's destructive or ransomware or whatever it might be. And we've done a terrible job of policing that, both from the computer science side in terms of making it more difficult and inhospitable for criminals, and on the regulatory side for actually passing laws and going after the criminals. And some estimates I've seen that it's a $600 billion a year industry. And that it's Russia's second largest source of foreign currency after oil.
You mean blackmailing cities?
Blackmailing, direct theft of accounts by bypassing security features,
right.
phishing, all the rest of it. And and most people have been victims of it in one way or another. And yet there's very little policing activity aiming to stop it, as far as I can see.
Yeah.
So we have to get the handle on that, because it's going to get worse and worse as the AI technologies that the criminals can use become more capable.
Well, this day we're recording this week was that hack of Equifax, 140 million driver's license, social security numbers, and so on. 4 guys.
Oh, that was the indictment of those guys. I think it happened in 2017, but yeah.
They didn't just do it. It was their indictment. Okay, I see. All right, I remember that happened.
It took them 2.5 years, I think, to find out who did it, or at least
claim. Okay, right. Well, that's even worse that it took us that long to figure out who did it.
Yeah, I mean, the internet is not set up to allow forensic discovery.
Oh, right.
So it's almost the opposite. And anyway, so if we can get a handle on that, which I think is partly an international issue, because a lot of the activities cross-border, we actually need international agreements. So there's a Budapest Convention, but it's only signed by the good guys, so to speak.
Right.
Which doesn't help that much.
And do you worry about the 2020 election and hacking the election and all that stuff, like what happened in 2016?
Yes. I think many of the local administrations are a little bit more aware of the risks, but many of them are still completely oblivious to what's going on. So,
as we just saw in the Iowa caucuses, they couldn't even count up 1,700 votes on an app.
Well, yeah, that's another story.
Yeah, okay. But
I should really. We should wrap up.
Yeah. No. That's it. Now your book is great. Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence and the Problem of Control. It's a great read for us general readers that don't know much about this topic. I highly recommend it. What's next on your plate?
So I just finished the fourth edition of my textbook.
Oh, right.
So that occupied me from the time I finished Human Compatible until a couple of days ago. And what's next is basically redoing all of the technical areas of AI um, to fit this new paradigm, right? So if you look at each chapter of the textbook, it's based on the assumption that the objective is known and fixed. So we have to redo the technical content of each part of AI
Right.
to allow for the fact that the objective is not known. But it's not just that. You also have to then figure out, well, what's the protocol whereby additional information can be acquired from the human? And people like crisply defined formal frameworks. So we have to come up with some natural but crisply defined frameworks whereby humans communicate information to machines about preferences in each of these contexts, whether it's combinatorial search or planning or decision making under uncertainty and so on, reinforcement learning. These all have to be redone in the new paradigm. So that'll keep us busy.
Yeah, you have your work cut out for you. We're counting on you to prevent the apocalypse in the next 50 years. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for coming on, and congratulations on the new book. It's a terrific read.
Thank you very much.